Welcome everybody here to the Heritage Foundation. First, I want to thank the Clear with Loose Policy Institute for this week's Conservative Women's Network discussion. My name is Melanie Israel. I'm a research associate here at the Heritage Foundation in the DeVos Center for Religion and Civil Society. And one of the things that I have the opportunity to work on here at the Heritage Foundation is something that Professor Alvaré is very familiar with: life, religious liberty, marriage, all of those non-controversial issues that we deal with today. But I just want to go ahead and kick things off and introduce Professor Alvaré. She's a professor of law at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University, where she teaches family law, law and religion, and property law. She publishes on matters concerning marriage, parenting, non-marital households, and First Amendment religion clauses. She's a faculty advisor to the law school's Civil Rights Law Journal, the Latino Law Student Association. This is a really long, impressive list, too, so bear with me. Among other things, maybe I won't do the exhaustive list. Among other things, she advises the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops here in D.C. She's founder of Women Speak for Themselves, consultant for ABC News, and prior to joining the law school faculty, she taught at Columbus School of Law and the Catholic University of America. She's represented the USCCB before legislative bodies, and she's also been a litigation attorney in Philadelphia. Again, this is just among other things. Very impressive resume. She received her law degree from Cornell University School of Law and her master's degree in systematic theology from the Catholic University of America. And for anyone who has seen Professor Alvaré speak at a conference or watched one of her talks on YouTube, you know that we're all in for a very real treat. So with that, I just want to go ahead and turn it over to you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. And I understand this is your first day back from maternity leave?
Yes.
Go, girl. This is very impressive. Congratulations. So thank you for coming. I'm as interested in hearing from you as I am in speaking with you because the subjects that I deal with are so hard that I'm always looking for ideas. When I worked for the U.S. Bishops Conference and I was on television and radio a couple times a week for 10 years, people would send me stuff. Literally, sometimes I'd be trying to leave a town after giving a talk, and people would be slipping pieces of paper into the window as I was rolling it up and saying bye-bye. But what I learned to do is keep these giant piles of things and mine them. And so, for instance, Project Gabriel was a woman who spoke to me in Texas. You know, if parishes agreed to take care of any woman in a crisis pregnancy, it was basically anything she needs in her life. That was a woman slipping a piece of paper through the window to me in Texas. And other things that come by way of conversation with women all over the United States. The same is true of my group, Women Speak for Themselves, where we're constantly getting feedback from women and then pushing it out to other women. I have to stop the Cuban thing of talking with the hands. I can see that. So ostensibly, I was asked here today because I've put out a new book, and I will be touching on it, but I will not be boring you with all the details. Putting Children's Interests First in U.S. Family Law and Policy. With power comes responsibility. What it really is a story of how the federal government, through the courts and many different administrations, both legislatively and through the executive, promoted a philosophy and a legal practice of what I succinctly call sexual expressionism, which is sexual expression by people, most particularly women, completely severed from children, and with indifference to marriage, whether or not it takes place in or outside of marriage, which I chronicle the legal rise of, show the philosophical interplay with the law, then show the fallout for children. Children's family structure is created at conception. Now, there are people who marry after the child is born, but the percentages of divorce among those groups is very, very high. So effectively, the child's family structure is created at conception, and it's a call for adult responsibility for children. So in many ways, it's a comment on a particular facet, that is our responsibility for children and their family structure of the sexual revolution. Okay, so what I thought I would talk about today, and I have just a few points and then I would love to chat, is my sort of coming to grips with how important this question was, how we got here, what the results are, why all of our data and thoughtful arguments are falling on deaf ears. Is there a way to remedy this? And what I'm trying. Okay, so those are some of the points. So I just want to say I came to this issue, some of you, and a decreasingly few number, because like most of you look like 18, but I'm sure you're 20-something, who in the 1990s, I was the public face for the US bishops on the pro-life issue. And so I did their congressional testimony before Democratic and Republican platform committees, lobbying, legislative drafting, Supreme Court brief drafting, and then all of the television, radio, print media appearances. And, at that time, the abortion issue was in the predicament that the marriage issue is today. In other words, we were declared dead and gone. It's over, which is so ironic when you think about where we are today, a couple days after Wednesday. They were really looking for somebody to make the women's pro-life case. And they were like, hey, Hispanic Ivy League law grad with 5 years of graduate systematic theology, you'll do. Sort of, would you subsume that into this position? So I, in that job, made the logical case on abortion. And we really did make some headway in the 1990s, partial birth abortion and the other side's sort of cynical and very much lying opposition to any restriction on abortion. The back and forth of that was unbelievable. I was pregnant 6 times during the 90s, and I went into labor twice fighting on partial birth abortion. I knew we were going to win eventually. So we made the women's case on that. We've come a long way. People agree that you don't have to have 2 heads and hate women and be a Nazi to be pro-life now. We really did make some, that's where we were. It was crazy. To be a pro-life woman. And it's hard to imagine now, because now it's still not popular among the media at all, but you're not considered a hater in the same way you are on the marriage issue. So we made some progress. During that time, a couple of the bishops I was working for, most particularly at that time, Cardinal O'Connor and Cardinal Keeler from Baltimore, O'Connor was in New York, wanted me to get in touch with post-aborted women to see what we could have said. What could we have said? What did you need to know or hear? And so I spent a year talking with post-aborted women, like every other day, a couple hours. It was really amazing. And it was often I'd talk to a woman and I'd be like, oh my gosh, she's like my doppelganger. She's me. But then she had this situation in her life, and then she torqued out of control. And it was just an amazing education for me. What I learned was that we had to be more concerned with what I now call the demand side of abortion. I say that in economic terms, right? Most pro-life groups are dealing with the supply side. Let's shut down the clinics. Let's make it, let's have people think much harder about going to one in the first place. Let's ban various kinds, various times. The demand side is really the sex, mating, and marriage marketplace that gives rise to crisis pregnancies in the first place, okay? And in fact, if you really look at this book, it is the chronicle of how we constructed the sex, mating, and marriage marketplace that we're in now, legally and philosophically, and then its results. And it also chronicles the government's failed attempts to sort of say, well, we don't care whether you're single or married when you conceive a child unless you're a teenager. But if you do, we know there's going to be trouble. So here's some backdoor programs to try and make it up to those kids on the backside. And here's some contraception to try and prevent these kids being conceived in the first place. But of course, we know that the out-of-wedlock birth rate has gone up by 8 times, 12 times among poorer women since the government started pumping contraception into the public arena. 8 to 12 times increase in non-marital pregnancies since 1970. So clearly, totally failed on that end. You know, in the book, I go through, and you probably know these cases like you know your mother, the movement from Griswold, the invention of a right of privacy, from the penumbras and emanations of other constitutional rights in 1965 that struck down one of the last remaining laws in the country that banned the sale or use of contraception for married people on the grounds that their marital bedroom and their marital relationship was private. Then you move on to Eisenstadt versus Baird, where the court says, well, what is marriage? It's just two people with separate and individual hearts and minds. And so really what we meant by that right of privacy was the right of private people, that is women, in their heads, not in marital bedrooms, not in the marital relationship, but in their heads to make decisions about matters so fundamental as whether or not to bear or beget a child. Therefore, single people have a constitutional right to access contraception. And at this point, even the Catholic Church, who has a theological teaching against contraception, was not seeking to make contraception illegal. Nobody is, right? But still, saying that a right of privacy to make decisions about fundamental matters was extended to single people, including even teens without their parents' permission, was a really important factor in creating the sex, mating, and marriage marketplace we have today. Let me just go on a little, and then I'll come back for that. Then, of course, you have Roe versus Wade that relies on the Eisenstadt case, which had given the right of contraception to single people to say, well, the right of privacy means the right to decide about matters relating to bearing or begetting a child. That's what abortion is about. Let's extend it to abortion. Then you get to the Casey decision, which says the right of privacy is really about the right to shape your own universe. This is the now gone Justice Kennedy's language. It's the right to decide the shape of your universe. No. And the court has backed away from that from time to time, but never on sex. On sex, they adhere to that language. On anything else, they say, clearly that's silly. You know, clearly that's silly. If the shape of your universe involves abusing your children or, you know, using schedule whatever drugs that are banned, no, you can't shape your universe. What we really mean is on sex, you shape your universe. So it becomes very much narrowed to that. Even the right to commit suicide, the right to take your own life. No, that's not universe shaping and self-defining. Clearly, they're just making it up as they go along. Then you get to Lawrence versus Texas, which says that sodomy between two men is a federal constitutional right. That the right of abortion and contraception, that is the right to have sex irrespective of marriage and without anything even being thought of regarding procreation. Why shouldn't that apply to gay sex? In fact, when I was at a conference at Yale, I'd like to say being roasted on Obergefell, the head of, formerly the head of gay law, now the head of family law at Yale. And in fact, if you look at family law profs around the United States, it's more and more the case that they're coming formerly being wholly gay law profs, and now they've moved over and they're running family law programs in the United States. It's an interesting shift. Anyway, he says to me, listen, after you all heterosexual types and at the Supreme Court decided that sex was unrelated to marriage and unrelated to children, then you already gave it all away. It's not our fault. You already upheld a right to same-sex marriage. You just didn't know it yet. So then, of course, you get Obergefell, which says that states may no state may declare that they have a special interest in procreation or in a child being linked with his or her mother or father. But rather, every state must declare as utterly the same relationships that cannot procreate and those that can, relationships that would connect a child to a mother and father, and relationships that in every single case would separate a child from mother, father, and both. That every state must agree that these are equal state interests. So that's the trajectory. In the book, I also describe the philosophical and cultural trends, a right to happiness, transgressive sex as freedom, just breaking taboos without any consideration of who they harm or whether they're good for you is freedom. if you ever want to read one of the best writings on this I've ever seen is an Israeli sociologist named Eva Illush. She has 2 books. One is Love Hurts, and the other one is, what is it, Romancing the Capitalist Utopia or something like that. Amazing. Who talks about just the idea that you could strike a blow for freedom by having taboo sex. You don't even have to help anybody. In fact, you could hurt somebody, but that's freedom all on its own. So I do all of these interplay between the law and these cultural trends and how they resulted in the sexual expressionist system we have today. So what happens, and what I want to stress today is, I've already talked about children's family structure, but what I want to stress today is how this ends up immiserating women. Why? Well, in the book, and I do look at this, you can look at the most hands down, what is considered the most reliable studies of sexual organization in the United States, sexual opinions by University of Chicago in the 1990s, updated. They agree that, you know, the Kinsey report, the Haidt report are complete trash. I mean, there really isn't any disagreement in the empirical literature anymore that Kinsey and Haidt, which were the reports that people rely on to say what people's sexual preferences are, have no empirical traction whatsoever. University of Chicago study is really the definitive one, and the one everybody cites in reliable studies at Harvard, Chicago, et cetera. And they point out that even though women and men both like sex with marital commitment best, women like it even much more than men. So I won't go through all the studies they've done on this. The most famous one that gets in the newspaper is where complete random strangers, women go up to men on college campuses and ask them if they want to have, you know, no-string sex, and men go up to women and do the same. And women reject it in like 98.9 cases, and men accept in very high percentages of cases. They also show, and these studies of 162 countries show the same. I mean, there really aren't any reliable studies that show other than women have a much stronger preference for commitment with their sex. You also, of course, have the fact that women have fertility constraints, that men, the Larry King rule, can procreate till whenever, and women really do have fertility constraints, and it's much easier and much healthier to have your children on the younger side, usually. You also have the fact that, you know, birth control is made for women. You have the fact that women are the ones who get pregnant. Women are the ones who go through labor. Women are the ones who go through abortion. Women are the ones who suffer post-abortion distress. And in the United States, in 86% of single-parent situations, it's women. Worldwide, it's like 94, 95%. Some writers have put this very well by saying, that ain't culture, that's nature. By the time you get to a 95% choice across all countries, women will make that sacrifice, which they also regard as a great joy and a great gift. So you're looking at a sexual revolution where almost everything, except some of the emotional, right? And men do, and I'm not discounting that men do have regret or sadness or a preference for commitment with their sex. Although when they say commitment, sometimes they mean 3 to 6 months, and a woman usually means a lifetime. Which of course is also paradoxical because women file 70% of divorces. We could talk about that. But in any event, women have, so they like commitment more, they have the fertility time constraint, they really bear huge amounts of the pharmacological, emotional, and financial aspects of having sex, getting pregnant, having an abortion, or bearing the child. What's really weird, and by the way, poor women suffer more of this than anybody. Poor women are the biggest sufferers in all of this, and there really isn't any doubt about that. If you want to look at the most sympathetic and stunning sociological treatment of that, the one accepted hands down in the sociological community across right and left, it's Catherine Eden and Maria Kafalos' book, Promises I Can Keep, Why Poor Women Put Motherhood Before Marriage. It's amazing. And I did 18 months research of all the qualitative and quantitative literature about poor women's decisions to have children. It's on SSRN for those of you who use that free social science research network. It's about what the government is stupidly saying to poor women in light of what we actually know about poor women's decision making. In any event, the problem that we're facing now is that all thoughtful arguments about the sexual revolution are a failure. And here's where I get into questions and proposals versus statements of fact. The sexual revolution seems almost immune to criticism, even though we know women are not loving it. The best way to actually even define the sexual revolution is to get women to change their minds about sex, is to get women to unlink sex from tomorrow. You know, some of the philosophers and sociologists who are by no means conservative, Zygmunt Bauman in Poland, who wrote Liquid Love and Liquid Modernity, Anthony Giddens, The Transformation of Intimacy, possibly the greatest sociologist of the 20th century. They all say, listen, the birth control pill and abortion, we think they're fine. But face it, they separated sex from future, kin, marriage, children, tomorrow, love. And this is Anthony Giddens' The Transformation of Intimacy. This is Zygmunt Bauman's Liquid Love. They just did. I mean, you can still decide, I think both of these or one of these is fine, but you do have to accept that once you separate sex from even the idea that this is the only place nature stuck baby making, you know, it could have put it anywhere, right? If you're a religious person, you think God could have done it anyway. But he put it at the intersection of the man and the woman. He put it in the context of a romance. He made it so that the child benefits from the care of both parents. Maybe this is something we should think about when we think about sex. But the pill says, no, don't think about any of that. Are you kidding? That's a downer. And abortion says that as well, with adding killing to it. But the sexual revolution has been immune to arguments, even regarding women's well-being. And when I was writing my book, my husband says to me, Helen, I know your entire premise is that people will care about children, but you're totally wrong. They actually don't. And I don't entirely disagree with him. Children don't vote. There's very few exceptions. Children do not donate to political campaigns. Children are required. Hans Jonas, sort of the prophet of environmentalism, in his book, what's his book? Responsibility. Anyway, he's the guy who invented environmentalism philosophically. But it's shocking how much of his book talks about what we owe to children, and that they are the classic. The is of their vulnerability points to the ought of our care. They didn't ask to be made. We make them. We know what we're doing when we make them, right? And we owe them. And you'd think, and I make argument after argument, and I use, by the way, just FYI, in case you think it matters, I use nothing but sources from the left, from the World Health Organization, from the CDC under President Obama, from the Obama White House, from the mouths of the Supreme Court, from Brookings Institute, from Planned Parenthood, from Guttmacher. There are no conservative sources in the book. Not one. Won't make any difference. No family law review will look at it, and nobody will take it seriously if they don't already, if they're not already disposed. Okay? I used, peer-reviewed scientific journals. I did everything I could. The case is made. But with regard to the well-being of children and the well-being of women, they seem immune. Okay? Even the argument regarding the poor. The only people who have, I think, done, some move in the direction of, well, maybe we really do need to assist the poor on this. Brookings has they have a lot of problematic stuff on basically long-acting reversible contracepting 13 to 29-year-olds, which to me is just an invitation to abuse them. But they have some stuff that says, no, we really need to promote marriage and marital childbearing for children. But they would get at it by basically making the woman sort of sterile for 16 years, poor women especially. And I think that you're not going to change the sex mating and marriage marketplace by saying there's no problematic with not being responsible about sex. between 16 and 29. It won't hurt your future relationships. It won't hurt your marriage. We know the more non-marital relationships you have, the more divorce-prone you are. I mean, it's almost a straight shot, except for one little glitch in the data. It's oddly enough, people who've had 2 partners do worse than people who've had like 3 or 4. Isn't that weird? 0 or 1, your odds of divorce are really, really low. 2, your odds shoot way up. And then a little less than 2 for 3 or 4, still drastically higher than 0 or 1. But otherwise, we just know that it's not a good thing for marriage, right? And so I don't think the Brookings solution works. We also have this obsession with abortion. I mean, do I need to say anything else than for you to just follow the tweets that have come out from the media in connection with Kennedy's retirement? And I told Bridget that I wanted to share with you. I got an interview request from Vox yesterday, right? And I think they're sort of uber left, right? Vox. I mean, that's their whole shtick. Anyway, they said to me, "Will Roe be overturned? And what do you think about Jeffrey Toobin?" Who does he write for? Someone, Slate, Salon. Anyway, what do you think about Toobin's comment that abortion would be illegal in 20 states in 18 months? And I said, you know, the entire legal premise of Roe versus Wade is that there is a non-textual constitutional right to abortion on substantive due process grounds. Substantive due process is the court's way of saying that there is an American principle that is so deep and so universally held and so bedrock that we cannot do other than recognize it, even though it's not in the Constitution. If 20 states outlaw abortion in 18 months, after 45 years of fighting about Roe v. Wade, and Roe came down when every state banned abortion for most reasons, and now we still have half the states who are willing to do it tomorrow, then obviously the reversal of Roe will be exactly constitutionally required. It will have proved what the court did was right. So thank you, Jeff Toobin, because I think you're right, and I also think you've just proved that the reversal of Roe is a constitutional necessity. Thank you. I mean, that was my only response I could say. Every time they're going to say it, I'm going to say exactly, and that's why it had to be reversed, because it never was a substantive due process, right? It never was part of the fabric of our liberty. Okay, 2 more points, then I'm going to stop. So the abortion obsession, I don't know why. We could think about it theologically, you know, throwing creation back in God's face, saying there is no given. I make myself. I mean, that's one possibility. Materialism. My husband jokingly, not so jokingly, says on his darker days, which are like most days politically, that the United States is not a culture with an economy. It's an economy with a culture loosely attached. And we are incredibly materialist, and children, you know, cost. They cost us in time and money, and people are not so happy about that all the time. The cultural influences that I've already described. Abortion has become the proxy war between the left and the right. Do you actually, I mean, if the left didn't have abortion and same-sex marriage, would they have anything? And have you actually asked yourself the question about the right? If we didn't have pro-life, is there, what else is so sure, right? If the Republican Party or if conservatives got rid of the pro-life issue, they'd be done. They would fracture into so many parts. So it's become a proxy war, right? So that's a part of why the obsession. The church is very hobbled right now, not just because of the sex abuse crisis and the recent revelation about Cardinal McCarrick. Am I being taped? The sex abuse crisis in the church has really hobbled our ability to speak as a church, as someone who has done advising for the U.S. bishops. I also think we have not conformed our language to the times in ways that speak. But I have kids who are 19, 21, 25. I understand more and more. You know, I'm constantly in a communication space to talk about something. And I feel like I need a PhD in communications in order, and I'm always working on my language. I'm always reading. I'm always trying to work it, to try and communicate in the face of what we're facing now on these issues, right? And the Catholic Church is, and the evangelical churches are struggling on this. And the rapid rise so quick that we didn't even have time to get our language together, of the same-sex marriage movement. And it's being posited as, the all goodness and happiness and light versus churches who want a license to discriminate from the government. That it's just a really difficult time for the church. And I have some ideas on that, but not time to share them at the moment. The final thing I'll say is I have an effort called Women Speak for Themselves. I have another website, I Believe in Love. And through these, I am attempting at Women Speak for Themselves to actually inform a large cohort of women. Here's the issues. Here's the facts. Here's some ways to talk about them. Here's the issues. Here's the facts. And they are extremely well-sourced. There will not be any just sort of self-serving, strictly political, one-sided. No. Here's some really serious research. You should look at our fact sheet, for instance, on long-acting reversible contraceptives. I mean, I've had doctors and nurses call me and say, my God, it's so balanced, right? It's really thoroughly researched. And makes a case not by ideology or by rhetoric, but with facts. So, and then I Believe in Love is working poor Americans writing about their particular struggles, trying to link sex, marriage, and children, and why they are struggling right now, which is very complex, right? It's not just that family structure is, if you talk about it, you're considered to be a bigot. Oh, you hate people who don't have X. It's also because they do have unique problems regarding education, regarding employment, regarding, right now we know, the opioid crisis. And then they're also suffering, the ball got rolling, and they have intergenerational family structure problems now. But at Women Speak for Themselves, I realize sometimes that, I wake up in the morning like with the weight of the world, thinking, okay, how can I change everything today? I've got 77,000 women on this list. We give them stuff. They use it in their kids' schools, at a community meeting, to go lobby a member of Congress, to write to the HHS, to write an editorial. And we are trying to make it as easy as possible to develop this verbal, visible cohort of women. Because women right now are caught in the prisoner's dilemma, right? If you don't go along with the sex, mating, and marriage marketplace, there's always another individual woman who can be pressured to. And then another individual, versus if women were together, they could say as a unit, no, sorry, this has not been good for us. And we're all going to do things differently. We are trying to, by accretion, build up a cohort of women who can say, here's where women's freedom really lies, and have the ability to speak about it. Okay? I'm going to stop there and take your questions.
And we do have a microphone, so will you please wait to ask your questions until after we have the microphone, and be sure to state your name, who you're affiliated with. We want to make sure that everybody here in the audience and watching online can hear both the question and answer.
Thank you, Bridget Wagner, Heritage. Thanks, Helen. Really such important remarks to share with us, particularly with the young women, I think, here. Now, I know your husband is pessimistic about some of these things, and at times he influences you, but are you a bit more optimistic seeing like the growth of students for life in this next generation and going forward? And I think 77,000 women is nothing to sneeze at, obviously, and the group could grow even further. But tell me what your vision, and I know you are in touch with your children's friends. What do you think? How do you account for that growth in that next generation, and how can we build on that going forward?
So there's several things that should be said. One is, it really was like the National Right to Life Committee and the Catholic bishops, like carrying so much of the water for like 3 decades. And there were some other groups that had some national recognition. I wish, Feminists for Life was always one of my favorites. And that had some. But now, the number of groups that are female-headed, incredibly influential. So in 1994, I started with Rachel McNair from NOW, formerly of NOW, the Susan B. Anthony list, with $2,000, and I babysat for the FEC lawyer who filed the papers for us. My husband and I borrowed $2,000, and we threw the first party. And then we handed it over to a couple of powerhouse women, and I could never do what needed to be done with that. But then you have Marjorie Dannenfelser today, who's a force of nature. You have Kristen Hawkins at Students for Life. You have Lila Rose. I don't want to short any. You have Americans United for Life. You have National Right to Life Committee. I mean, the size and power and voice of the pro-life movement against every single elite institution, every single, without exception. It is hard for you to really gauge, because I lived through it from the 80s. I remember what it was like if you told someone you were, pro-life and not an idiot. It was kind of like, no, that can't be. Right? The National Catholic Reporter referred to me as lip-syncing male views in the 90s. Like, it couldn't be. She's educated. She must be saying what those guys think. I mean, it's hard for you to imagine that we are where we are today against those odds. So, I mean, talk about your reason for hope. The other thing is, things are so disconnected. Sex is like, it's, my husband used to phrase tennis. Like, it's less than tennis. It's not even as fun as a game of tennis, right? It's so coerced. It's so pornified. Between Me Too and every time I start reading about porn, I'm doing some work for the Polish government who's thinking about revamping their family code, and so I'm doing some summaries and recommendations. And one of the things they asked me to do was on child pornography and on sexualization of children. And I spent 7 days reading in a row while I've been up with my little limpy foot here, which I just had operated on. And I said to my husband, I feel disgusting and dirty, and I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to read another thing, even about the law. I'm wondering if it has gotten so crazy where, if Mark Regnerus' research, the sociologist at University of Texas, in his book Cheap Sex or Premarital Sex in America, that now 1 out of every 3 sexual encounters on a college campus is pre the first date, pre a date. The second one is like the day you met or the day of the date or the day after. It's only a third that come at a later point. Again, this is just campuses, but I'm wondering if this is such a reduction of sex. It's so ridiculous. And if the instability in children's lives and in society, especially the role it's playing in poverty, is reached such a limit that old-fashioned things like stability, security, roots might make a comeback. When you referred to my children's friends, Bridget, having a conversation with some of them recently. My son graduated college just a few weeks ago. They're in the quarter system, so it was just a couple weeks ago. And they were talking about how, we make these friends, we live in another city, for all these years, and then you break us off. And one of the conversations was, why didn't you have us go to school a little closer to where we had a community? Because now we're losing each other, and this is so sad. And this doesn't seem wise. And I've had conversations with people from India and Australia who said to me, why are you sending your children to Chicago? What were you thinking? Why don't you give them roots? I feel so bad, right? But one of the things they said is, and then shortly after that, I was talking to them and I made reference to, my parents have died in the last 6 years, and I was cleaning out one of my father's things, and I found a prayer book of his that he used. He went on retreat with the same guys. He's an immigrant from Cuba. By the time he was in high school here in the United States, he made this group of friends, and he went away for a silent retreat with the same guys from high school through to his 80s. And one of this group of my children's friends went, okay, that's what we're talking about. Now he has friends. It's like, go figure. So I actually am beginning to wonder if we've actually reached the limit on meaningless sex. Sex that is utterly devoid of tomorrow. And I just wonder. And that's why I keep thinking, so for me, my strategy, and this, I suspect that many people here will differ from that, I have not been part of political campaigns. I understand some people need to do that. But as a scholar, I have stayed out of party and individual campaigning and stuck to putting out, again, but I've chosen the scholarly route on this, putting out good information about things that makes, I think, a principled case. And I've done that for decades. I had Kate Michelman, who ran NARAL in the 80s and 90s, and I was in the cover of the Philadelphia newspaper for something controversial. And she said, no, you can trust her. She sticks to the facts. I thought, okay, you know what? That's a good strategy for me. And I do think that the combination of the limit situation we're in, combined with being ladies and gentlemen about this, and being truthful, and being willing to dialogue, even though I do fear that we are in a post-dialogue world. I think one of the things you do is to open up a conversation with someone and saying, I hope you're open to dialogue. I hope that's not where we are. You have to even sort of set that groundwork now. You can't presume that anymore. I hope that you'll agree that if we are both using facts and willing to debate with one another and show our hands, that we can have a conversation. Because if you don't agree on that, then I'm very worried. And then you start your conversation. Anyway, that's a long answer, but.
Hi, Rachel Delgidis here at Heritage. You had mentioned earlier that you think that the marriage debate right now is kind of where the abortion debate was when abortion was legalized and soon thereafter. Do you have any insights or thoughts on like how we can just like jump ahead on this and like have that dialogue? Because I know it's so critical for that right now.
Yeah, you know, one thought I have. So I wrote an article that you might want to look at. It was in First Things, and it was a review of Robert Oscar Lopez's book, Jephthah's Daughters. So Robert Oscar Lopez is a man, lived as gay for a while. He is happily married to a woman with children now, was raised by two mothers, and really, you know, he's an English literature professor from Yale. Talk about a cry from the heart. The book is, anyway, I reviewed the book. And in the book, one of the things I said was that the only thing I can imagine on same-sex marriage is that it will have its Judith Wallerstein moment. You don't remember Judith Wallerstein, but in 1990, she wrote a book about the lives of children of divorce. And again, you don't remember 1990, but by that time, divorce, I've done a lot of, again, on SSRN, you can find my papers. I went through, in one of my law review articles, and looked at every line of the debates over no-fault divorce. I looked at every line of the legislative history of the first no-fault divorce proposal, which, by the way, it's so fascinating. You know where no-fault divorce was invented? French Revolution. Isn't that interesting? And then the Bolshevik Revolution adopted it, and both of them went back on it because the children were out of control suffering. And then they came back to it in the 1960s. So anyway, I went through all the history of no-fault divorce, and all that time they said the children are going to be happier because if you know, mommy and daddy aren't happy, the children are going to be miserable. Then you discover, of course, that most people who stay together, that only a pretty low percentage of divorces follow real serious conflict. And the people who stay together report themselves happier when they're not in a high conflict situation than the people who divorced, 5-10 years later. According to, this is, what's her name? Linda, come on, she's a sociologist at University of Chicago. She co-authored the book with Maggie Gallagher on the case for marriage. What's her name? Anyway, this is serious, first-rate research. So in the 1980s, the line still was, if mommy and daddy ain't happy, then the kids aren't going to be happy, and the kids will be much better off, and hey, they're really resilient. And Judith Wallerstein comes out with this book and goes, no. And then you had the Dan Quayle was right moment, where Dan Quayle ridicules Murphy Brown as showcasing a very whitewashed image of single parenthood, and then it turns out that a major sociological account years later on the cover of the Atlantic magazine, maybe the most famous cover ever, Dan Quayle was right, says, no, actually the children are suffering. The niggling problem at the back of my head is how long will it take before that's admitted? Will it ever be admitted? will it be permitted to be discussed? The children of same-sex partnerships today are, over 80% of them were created in a prior heterosexual relationship, according to the Gay Law Williams Institute out in California. So over 80% of children in same-sex households were from a prior heterosexual marriage or a dating relationship. But more and more and more and more of them are going to be from new reproductive technologies or adoption. We know that there's children have a hunger for their lineage. And this is, you can see the sources of that. I discussed it in my book. What's really interesting is, you know who's the biggest proponent of the possible right of a child to know his or her parents on the Supreme Court? It'll shock you. Sotomayor. So in the book, I chronicle Sotomayor's discussion. It was in the context of an Indian child welfare case where because we split Native American children from their parents, she waxes eloquently in that case about there may be a constitutional right for a child. Now, I suspect if it were put to her, she'd say, well, that's only for a child who already knew the parent, not for one who was, sold at birth or adopted at birth. But it's interesting. So I do think the only thing I can think of is the children's case is the only one. If anyone has any other ideas for this, I'd be happy to hear them. But I just think the state, the other interesting thing is you have Japan and you have Western democracies, they're willing to put huge amounts of money on the line to keep their countries from demographically declining. If states are not allowed to value even procreative couples or linking children with their mother and father, I wonder. And we don't want the state instrumentalizing marriage as, well, you will give us citizens. This is why you may remember that Denmark had a very sexy campaign called Do It for Denmark. It was basically women stripping off clothes on a vacation saying, hey, we'll pay for your vacation, and if you're pregnant, you basically go on a vacation. If you come back and you can prove you got pregnant on it, we'll pay for your vacation. And then Russia had a go home and have sex day, they do that a couple times a year. Japan will pay enormous amounts of money for you to have a second or third child. I forget precisely. The third would be pushing it. I mean, they're at the one range. You just wonder if the state can really continue to say, we don't care about procreation. So I don't have a silver bullet. Those are just some thoughts.
Trish Seifert. I'm not a student. Would you comment on the recent Supreme Court decision, and I'm sorry I don't have the title, but in California where women... The
NIFLA?
The one where they don't have to learn about abortion
right.
services.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually I'm writing about that now. It was interesting. So I got interviewed by NPR on that. What day that came down? Wednesday? Tuesday. So that was a California law that said if you are an unlicensed facility, you don't have a medical license, but you just help women with crisis pregnancies, you have to post a note that says this is not a medical facility. We don't do medical procedures. If you are a licensed facility that does some things, like maybe you do an ultrasound or you do pregnancy tests, you have to put up a notice that says, by the way, do you know you can get an abortion free from the state of California? So it really was a free speech case. And because it came down the same day as the travel ban case, it got much, it would have been the premier case of the day if travel ban hadn't come down on the same day. But basically the court held that, and that Justice Thomas did the lead opinion, listen, if you want to keep people in California from giving the impression that they're medical when they're not, California has stiff criminal penalties already for claiming that you can practice medicine when you can't. It's fine, that already exists. If you want to give women information, California claimed that it was not responding. They said this in the facts that were agreed in the case. They weren't responding to fraud by clinics who were allegedly misleading women into thinking that they could do abortions at those facilities. California said, no, that's not what we're about. We're just about giving women widespread information that California will give you a free abortion if you want it. So the Supreme Court says, and without boring you with a lot of First Amendment law, if a law either says you can't speak or you must speak, this is a content-based regulation. It was only applicable, really de facto, and when you actually looked at who was covered by it, to places that helped women with crisis pregnancies. It forces speech on them. It is mandatory speech. It's like saying to Jehovah's Witnesses' kid, salute the flag. Okay? And so they said you can't force speech unless the state has, and here's the legal test, a compelling state interest in doing so, and realizing that compelling interest by means least restrictive of your free speech rights. They say, California, if what you want to do is just tell women, hey, free abortions are available, you got a million ways to do that. And by the way, we noticed the only people you burdened with this weren't your own clinics. They weren't pharmacies that do all kinds of morning after pills or anything. They were just crisis pregnancy centers. So this speech compulsion is so under-inclusive that we suspect that you're just targeting the content of their speech. And you have many other ways to tell women you can get free abortions in California. And also, California has laws against deceptive advertising. If it was the case that a crisis pregnancy center was kind of given the impression that, hey, we might get you an abortion here, you've already got a law to get them. You don't need this law. You're not using the least restrictive means to accomplish your ends. So they lost on speech grounds. And what was really interesting was Justice Kennedy's concurrence, which ended up being joined by 5 people, says, hey, California, you preambled the statute by saying you were going to be forward-looking, that this was a forward-looking progressive statute. You know what would be forward-looking? Read the First Amendment. It was a ringing endorsement of free speech and targeting content. It was fascinating. It was like taunting. It was kind of like being from Scalia Law School. It was kind of a Scalia move. Hey, you want to be forward-looking? Do this. It was very interesting. I guess we have one last question. Yes.
So I'm trying to figure out exactly how to put this, but something that I've noticed on my campus is that there's a sharp divide between the intellectuals and mainstream popular celebrities and what they support. And a lot of celebrities you'll see support hashtags, trends, Planned Parenthood, and they're very public about that on their platforms. And then the intellectuals don't get as much attention, especially like Students for Life. They don't get as much attention on campus, and we're not able to educate students. So how do you think that culturally we can ever go past that divide and try to move back towards facts, or do you think it's just whatever's popular at the current moment?
It's so hard. That's almost a communication, it's a communication strategy question. A couple things, just from experience. So one thing is you need to publish on whatever the opposition is talking about. So I published a couple of editorials on the Me Too movement, which said, you go girls, but you didn't go far enough. Consent will not protect you, which is so obvious. So engage the thing that's on the table and add something new. So when the contraception mandate forcing religious groups, including, the Little Sisters of the Poor and others, to provide free contraception, including abortifacient stuff, to women in their employ, one of the things we did is every time the Health and Human Services Department had a town hall, we alerted our women in advance, crashed it, and usually ended up having most of the comments. If they have thanks birth control, hashtag thanks birth control, we crash that handle hugely and just say, I'm not religiously opposed to it, or we usually don't get religion into it. But here's what it did to me. Or, here's the marketplace for sex and dating it's created. So we play in part, like this week, I've gotten requests from a lot of left media and a lot of conservative media. Why? Because they need to try and appear balanced, be willing to play. And which means, and women speak for themselves, we have stolen a phrase from probably the Marines, which is, drop and give me 50. If you want to change things, then the day that someone asks you for a 400-word editorial, or the day that you see that opportunity, or the day that you see a hashtag that is just driving you crazy, you need to hop on it. And you need to get your friends to hop on it and say, you want to see change? You got to give us an hour. Like, do you really want to do this or not? And I can just think of so many times when I literally would be like in an airport with a breast pump writing an editorial. I mean, it was like, okay, USA Today's given me the option. It is not, I don't like it. I hated it. There's a book, she was the first female MBA out of Harvard, and I think the first female MBA out of Harvard, and she wrote a book. She became president of like Radcliffe, and she's written a couple books on feminism, and she's like, sometimes this is what it looks like. You're at an airport in a stall with a breast pump and a date and another deadline, and this is awful. I don't recommend it. It'd be better to avoid that. I have it's a whole other subject, but I'm very lucky to have an academic schedule. Even when I didn't have an academic schedule, I demanded something like that after making myself valuable to my employer in other ways, so that I'd be like, you can't afford to let me go. Okay, I need to work from home for a while, But you have to do drop and give me 50. If someone gives you an opportunity, or if there's something trending that you need to at least have them answer to, that's a possibility. The other thing is, women speak for themselves. Part of what I'm trying to do is harness my academic knowledge, hand it over to 77,000 women, and say, okay, you go. I mean, and those women are everything. They're homeschooling moms, they're teachers, they're doctors, they're nurses, they're lawyers, they're students. And so if you have academics who you'd like to help translate, then communications is not a lesser art. It's right up there with the academics. Right? Because it's not going to get out unless you do it. So volunteer to be that communications brain, so that the stuff that that you notice, Heritage does it. Everybody who's putting out information does it. They say, tweet this, right? You do your story, and then you say, here's the message you want to put out. And that's really important, not just what to say because it's true, but how to say it. Let me just apologize for the price in advance. So it's an academic book. It's with Cambridge University Press. It's like $90. They're going to do paperback at the end of the year because it's selling well. So Amazon has it, or it might be that this still works. We may be past the deadline as of like July 1, but if you go on Cambridge University Press and you put in ASCAP Alvaré 30 as the discount code, I think you can get it for $70. ASCAP Alvaré 30. And I think there's some used ones on Amazon too. But they price it, they don't expect academic books to sell. But because I'm kind of an odd canary, and because I have networks, it has sold. So they're going to do paperback. So womenspeakforthemselves.com, sign up. And then we just send you, honestly, God, we don't send you that many mailings. It's like once a month. Like I did one on Kennedy yesterday, and it's just sort of, here's what we're thinking, and here's some stuff that we have to do. And again, our women speak for themselves. We are on the demand side of abortion, the sex, mating, and marriage marketplace that women are caught in. So what I said is, for instance, yesterday, it's a little newsletter, a little blog that says, hey, the world has got its hair on fire. We're going to have to show that if and when abortion does become illegal with the fifth justice, that the demand for it is not what people think, right? That we have the choice to be free and not to saddle ourselves with the crisis of a crisis pregnancy and the crisis of abortion. And Women Speak for Themselves can help you communicate that and talk about what that world looks like. So I'm kind of inserting us in the don't panic, a world without Roe is a beautiful world for women and children. Okay, so that's the kind of stuff I send out. I think I do fundraisers on that thing like twice a year. It is not like a daily fundraising thing. It's every couple of weeks, here's something hot, here's Me Too. Here's how we talk about it. Here's my editorial in the Washington Examiner. Here's my commentary in NPR. Here's 5 points that you can use. Please feel free to steal. Here's all the academic sources that support them. Here's a fact sheet. It is to the tagline or the mantra of Women Speak for Themselves is empowering women's voices. It's not about getting this on TV. I'm done. I'm old. Okay, you need to get that on TV. Okay, it's about empowering you to do it. Okay, leave me to write. Okay, thank you.
And just very quick, we've got a couple. So for Claire Booth Luce, we have our No Good Deed Goes Unpunished
Oh, I love
mug
that. That is so good. Yes.
and our tote bag.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. No good deed goes unpunished. I love that.
And got
Okay.
over here.
Oh,
Foundation.
thank you.
And just thank you so much for
You're
being here
welcome.
today. I know everybody learned a lot, and I definitely encourage you to go ahead and sign up so y'all can be hearing more from her. And we are going to be having lunch immediately following, so if y'all just want to head out these doors and hook a left, and then another immediate left, we'll have some lunch down in the conference room.